The heavy oak door of the gallery clicked shut, the sound echoing in the cavernous space with a finality that always settled deep in my bones. It was the sound of the world being locked out. For the next 8 hours, this wing of the museum, with its silent, watchful portraits and stoic marble busts, was my entire universe. I was used to the silence, to the company of ghosts preserved in oil paint and canvas. In fact, I preferred it. The silence didn't judge my worn-out sweaters or the tremor in my hands when I held a fine-tipped brush for too long. But tonight, the click was followed by something else. A soft rasp of fabric, the whisper of leather soles on polished stone, and then a voice, low and close to my ear, a quiet conspiracy that sent a shiver down my spine. 5 minutes, he murmured, the sound a low vibration against the shell of my ear. Just us. I froze, my hand hovering over the half-restored cheek of a 17th-century duchess. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew who it was without looking. Elias, the night guard, the one whose quiet patrols were the only other heartbeat in this mausoleum of art. He was a man of few words, a creature of routine and shadow, his presence usually announced only by the jingle of keys or a brief, flickering image on my security monitor. He had never spoken to me like this. His words were usually clipped, professional. Evening, Julian, everything secure in here? Coffee's fresh if you want some. This was different. This was intimate. My heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. Just us. The two words hung in the climate-controlled air, shimmering with a meaning I was terrified to touch. I could feel the warmth of his body behind me, a solid presence in the empty gallery. I smelled the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent, mixed with something uniquely his, something like cold night air and warm skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the Duchess, on the intricate network of cracks in her painted smile, pretending to be absorbed in my work, pretending my world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I heard him take another step, the sound impossibly loud in the hush, and then the faint rustle as he leaned against the doorframe just beyond my peripheral vision. Waiting. For what? I had no idea. And that was the most terrifying, most exhilarating thing of all. For years, my life had been a study in quiet observation. From my perch in the restoration studio, a glass-walled room overlooking the main galleries, I had watched the world go by. I watched the crowds ebb and flow, the bored children, the enraptured art students, the wealthy patrons. And at night, when the crowds were gone, I watched him. Elias. I learned the rhythm of his patrols, the way he walked with a steady, unhurried gait, his shoulders broad under the crisp navy blue uniform. I watched him on the grainy black and white monitors, a silent film star in my private theater. I saw him pause before the Rothko, his head tilted, his expression lost in the deep fields of color. I saw him gently straighten a velvet rope a visitor had disturbed. I saw him once, late on a Tuesday, stop in the Grecian statuary hall and trace the line of a marble discus thrower's arm, his touch so light it was almost a breath. He was a contradiction. His jaw was firm, his build solid, the kind of man you'd expect to be brash or loud. But he moved with a quiet grace, a reverence for the space he occupied. He was a guardian in the truest sense, not just of the art, but of the silence. I had constructed an entire persona for him in my mind, a life story built from these silent, stolen glances. He was a man seeking peace, someone who, like me, found solace in the quiet company of the past. I had painted him in my imagination with as much care as I applied to the canvases on my easel. And in my imagination, he was perfect, untouchable, a figure in a landscape I could admire from a safe distance. Now he was here, real, a warm, breathing presence just a few feet away, and his voice had just dismantled the comfortable distance I had so carefully maintained. My mind raced, trying to parse the intention behind those two simple words. Just us. Was it a threat? No, his tone was too soft, too calm. Was it a joke? Elias didn't joke. He barely spoke. Was it an invitation? My stomach twisted itself into a knot. An invitation to what? To acknowledge that for these 5 minutes, and perhaps for all the other nights we'd shared this silent space, we weren't just two employees occupying the same building, that we were the only two living souls in a city of sleeping giants and painted saints. I finally risked a glance, turning my head just slightly. He was leaning against the door jamb, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze not on me, but on the painting I was working on. The soft gallery lighting carved shadows under his cheekbones and highlighted the dark stubble along his jaw. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent. They were a deep, dark brown, the color of wet earth after a rain, and they seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't smiling, but the corner of his mouth was turned up, just slightly, in a way that suggested a private thought. "She looks sadder," he said, his voice still that low rumble. He nodded toward the Duchess on my easel. I cleared my throat, surprised he'd noticed. Surprised he was making conversation about the art itself. "That's the varnish," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison to his. "Centuries of it. It yellows, obscures the original colors. My job is to strip away the grime of time, to show what the artist intended." "So you take away the sadness," he said. It wasn't a question. "Sometimes," I admitted, turning back to the canvas. "Sometimes I find more of it underneath." The silence that followed was different from the usual quiet of the museum. It was active, charged. I could feel his gaze on me now, on the back of my neck, on my hands. I picked up a cotton swab, dipped it in the solvent, my movements precise and automatic, a desperate cling to routine in a moment that was anything but. I am a restorer. This is my job. This is what I do. I focused on the tiny square of canvas I was working on, watching as the yellowed varnish dissolved, revealing a brighter, more vibrant pigment beneath. A flash of royal blue in the Duchess's gown, hidden for 200 years. "You're good at that," he said. "The patience it must take." "It's all I'm good at," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. A raw, honest confession whispered into the dark. It was the truest thing I'd said to anyone in years. My life was about fixing broken things, about carefully, painstakingly bringing the past back to life. I was far less skilled at navigating the present, at dealing with real, living people. He didn't respond immediately. I held my breath, waiting for him to leave, for the 5 minutes to be up, for the moment to pass and be filed away as a strange anomaly. But he didn't move. The silence stretched, and I felt a prickle of sweat on my brow. Then he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I don't believe that." And then I heard it. The jingle of his keys. The soft click of the door opening, and then closing again, leaving me once more in the profound, echoing silence of the gallery. But it wasn't the same silence. It was a silence that was now filled with the ghost of his voice, the warmth of his presence, and a question that beat in time with my racing heart. What had just happened? The rest of that night passed in a blur of confused energy. I couldn't focus on the Duchess. Her newly revealed smile seemed to mock my turmoil. I kept replaying the scene in my head, dissecting every word, every nuance. "Just us," I don't believe that. They were simple phrases, but in the context of our silent, orbiting lives, they felt like seismic events. I packed up my tools an hour early, my hands still unsteady. As I walked through the deserted halls toward the staff exit, I found myself looking for him, my eyes scanning the shadowed corners and empty galleries. But he was gone, a ghost who had briefly materialized only to vanish back into the ether of his routine. The next night, I arrived at work with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, so tight it felt like I'd swallowed a fist. I was a creature of habit, of predictable patterns. My world was a controlled environment, just like the climate of the museum. Elias had introduced an unknown variable, and I didn't know how to compute it. I set up my station, the familiar smells of turpentine and linseed oil a small comfort. I tried to lose myself in my work, but my ears were straining, listening for the sound of his footsteps, for the jingle of his keys. He didn't come, not at the usual time. His patrol route seemed to have changed. I caught a glimpse of him on a monitor in the Egyptian wing, his back to the camera as he stared into a sarcophagus. I felt a ridiculous pang of disappointment, followed by a wave of relief. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just being friendly, making small talk to break the monotony of the long night. Maybe I had imagined the weight behind his words, projecting my own loneliness onto a simple, throwaway comment. That was the most likely explanation. It was the safest one. I forced myself to believe it. For the next week, I clung to that explanation like a prayer. Our interactions, if you could even call them that, reverted to the norm. A brief nod as he passed my studio. A quiet, evening, Julian that echoed in the hall. He didn't linger. He didn't whisper any more strange, intimate pronouncements. The comfortable distance was restored, and I told myself I was glad. I told myself it was better this way. I was a liar. Every night, my body tensed around 10 o'clock, the time he had appeared at my door that one evening. Every night, I felt a fresh wave of disappointment when he simply walked past, his shadow sliding silently across my floor. I started watching him on the monitors more intently, a secret obsession. I knew he took his first break at 11:15 p.m., always in the small staff room on the third floor. He drank his coffee black from a battered metal thermos. I knew he had a small tear in the seam of his right shoulder, one he hadn't bothered to mend. I knew he sometimes spent his entire 30-minute break in the Impressionist gallery, just sitting on the central bench, bathed in the soft light, looking at Monet's water lilies as if they held the answers to the universe. I was becoming a stalker in my own workplace, an observer cataloging the details of a life I had no part in. It was pathetic, but it was also the most alive I'd felt in a long time. The space between us, the silence, had become a canvas, and I was filling it with my own yearning, my own desperate colors. Then, one rainy Tuesday, about 2 weeks after the 5 minutes incident, something changed. I was in the archives, a subterranean level of the museum that smelled of old paper and dust, searching for provenance records for a new acquisition. The archives were a maze of rolling shelves and dim lighting, a place most staff avoided. I was wrestling with a heavy ledger when I heard a soft cough behind me. I jumped, startled, and spun around. It was Elias. He was standing at the end of the aisle, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't in his usual uniform. He wore a simple gray Henley that stretched across his chest and a pair of worn jeans. He must have just started his shift. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." "It's fine," I said, my heart doing that familiar, stupid flutter. I was just lost in the 18th century. I gestured vaguely at the ledger. He walked slowly down the aisle, his boots making soft sounds on the concrete floor. He stopped a few feet from me, his eyes scanning the shelves packed with priceless historical documents. "It's quiet down here." "Always," I said. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and unervingly steady. "I wanted to ask you something." "Okay." I breathed, my mind a complete blank. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something uncertain in his eyes. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look anything less than completely self-possessed. "My sister," he began, "she's an artist. A painter. She's struggling with her technique. She has this idea in her head, but she can't get the texture right. I was watching you work the other night, the way you build up layers. I was wondering if you could recommend a book or a website, something about classical layering techniques, glazing, scumbling, that sort of thing." I stared at him. Of all the things I had imagined him saying to me, this was not one of them. It was so normal, so practical, and yet it felt like a bridge. A deliberate step across the chasm of silence that separated us. "Of course," I said, a genuine smile breaking through my anxiety. "I can do better than that. I have a few old textbooks in my studio that are fantastic. I could lend them to you." To her. A look of real relief washed over his face. "Really? That would be great, Julian." "Thank you." He said my name like it was something he was tasting for the first time. It sounded different in his mouth. Solid. Real. "No problem," I said, my voice steadier now. I was on familiar ground here. Art was my language. "I'll bring them up. You can grab them from my studio before you start your rounds." "Okay," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. "Thanks again." He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the long, dim corridor. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the dusty ledger, my heart thumping a steady, hopeful rhythm. It was just a book, a simple request, but it felt like a key he had just handed me, and I had no idea which door it was meant to unlock. That night, I carefully selected 3 of my most treasured textbooks. I wiped the dust from their covers and placed a bookmark in a chapter on Venetian glazing techniques I thought his sister might find useful. I left the stack on the corner of my desk, a silent offering. I tried to work, but my eyes kept darting to the door of my studio, waiting. He appeared just after 9. He didn't come in. He just paused at the doorway, his frame filling the opening. "The books?" he asked, his voice quiet. I pointed to the desk. There. Let me know if she has any questions. He stepped inside. It was the first time he'd ever been in my personal space. The studio suddenly felt small, crowded with his presence. He walked over to the desk and picked up the top book, his large, capable hands surprisingly gentle as he flipped through the pages. His scent, that clean, cold air smell, filled the small room. I felt a strange, proprietary thrill watching him stand there, surrounded by my things, my tools, my unfinished projects. "This is perfect," he said, looking up at me. His eyes were dark and serious in the focused light of my task lamp. "She'll love this." He tucked the books under his arm. "I owe you one. Don't worry about it," I said, trying for a casual tone. He lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting around the studio, taking in the racks of solvents, the carefully organized brushes, the canvases leaning against the walls in various states of repair. His eyes finally landed on a small, personal painting I'd been working on in my spare time, an abstract landscape of a stormy sea. It was dark and turbulent, a reflection of my own internal state. I usually kept it covered. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment, as if he'd just read a page from my diary. He just looked at it for a long moment. "That's yours?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "It's good," he said simply. Then, with a nod, he turned and left, the jingle of his keys marking his departure. I sank into my chair, my legs feeling weak. He had seen a piece of me, a real piece. Not the careful, professional restorer, but the messy, emotional artist underneath. And he hadn't recoiled. He'd said it was good. The validation, coming from him, was a potent balm on a wound I hadn't even realized was open. Our relationship, if one could call it that, shifted after the night of the books. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared secret, a new and delicate thread of connection. He started making a point of stopping by my studio every night, always under the pretext of his patrol. He'd lean against the doorframe, just as he had that first night, and we would talk. Not for long, just a few minutes. He would ask about the Duchess, and I would explain the chemical process of removing the varnish. I would ask about his sister's painting, and he would describe her progress, his voice filled with a quiet, fierce pride. I learned her name was Clara. I learned he had raised her after their parents died. I learned he took this quiet, solitary job so he could be home during the day while she was in college. Each new detail was a brushstroke, adding color and depth to the portrait of him I carried in my mind. He was more than a stoic guardian. He was a brother, a protector, a man who had sacrificed his own ambitions for someone he loved. He, in turn, learned things about me. He learned about my passion for the Dutch masters, my frustration with a particularly stubborn patch of overpainting on a Vermeer, my secret belief that every painting held the ghost of its creator. He was a surprisingly good listener, his attention a palpable force. When I spoke, he watched my face with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most fascinating exhibit in the entire museum. One night, he brought me coffee. He just appeared at the door with 2 steaming mugs. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing one to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. A spark of heat, brief but electric, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. If he noticed, he gave no sign. He just leaned against the doorframe and sipped his own coffee, his eyes warm over the rim of the mug. The touch, as fleeting as it was, replayed in my mind for hours. It was nothing. An accident. A perfectly normal, insignificant contact. But my body didn't think it was insignificant. My skin still tingled where he had touched it. My internal monologue, which had been a low hum of anxiety and observation, was now a screaming chorus of what if. What if this wasn't just friendship? What if the way he looked at me, the way he sought me out in the vast emptiness of the museum, meant something more? I was terrified of the question, but I was more terrified of the hope that was beginning to bloom in the barren landscape of my heart. Hope was a dangerous thing. It demanded courage, and I was a man who had built his life around the avoidance of risk. It was safer to admire the art from behind the velvet rope, safer to love the idea of a person from a distance. To get any closer was to risk discovering the flaws, the cracks, the imperfections, to risk getting your heart broken. But with every quiet conversation, every shared cup of coffee, every accidental brush of our hands, Elias was slowly, methodically cutting the ropes and inviting me into the exhibit. and I was finding it harder and harder to stay behind the line. The breakthrough, when it came, was not born of a quiet conversation or a lingering look. It was born of chaos and cold water. It was a Thursday night in late autumn, the wind howling outside the museum's thick stone walls, rattling the century-old windows. A storm had been raging for hours, and the power had been flickering intermittently. I was working on a delicate piece, a small Tudor-era miniature that required intense focus and a steady hand. Suddenly, the lights went out. Not a flicker this time, but a deep, plunging darkness. The emergency lights kicked in a second later, casting the gallery in a ghostly, alien red glow. My heart leaped into my throat. Then I heard a sound that was far more alarming than the darkness. The sound of running water. Fast. A lot of it. I grabbed my phone, its flashlight cutting a nervous beam through the red gloom, and followed the sound. It was coming from the adjacent gallery, the one housing the museum's collection of rare, illuminated manuscripts. My blood ran cold. Those manuscripts were priceless and incredibly susceptible to water damage. When I entered the gallery, the scene was worse than I had imagined. A pipe in the ceiling, likely ancient and stressed by the storm, had burst. Water was gushing down the wall, pooling on the floor, and creeping dangerously close to a display case holding a 12th century book of hours. Panic seized me. I didn't know the protocol for this. My job was to fix things, not to handle emergencies. I fumbled for my radio to call security, my fingers trembling. But before I could press the button, a figure appeared in the doorway, a powerful flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Julian, are you okay?" It was Elias. His voice was calm, authoritative. He took in the scene in an instant, his eyes sharp and assessing. "The manuscripts," I choked out, pointing a shaking hand at the encroaching puddle. He didn't hesitate. "Right," he said, his voice a firm command that cut through my panic. "The main water shutoff for this wing is in the basement. It's going to take me a few minutes. We need to move this case. Now." The display case was heavy, solid oak, and thick glass. It was meant to be immovable. "I don't think we can," I said, my voice full of doubt. Elias was already at one end of it. He braced himself, his jaw set. "We don't have a choice. Get the other side." His certainty was contagious. I shoved my phone in my pocket and moved to the other end of the case. The water was already soaking into my shoes, cold and shocking. "On three," he grunted. "1, 2, 3. We pushed. The case scraped against the marble floor with a horrible, groaning sound, but it moved. An inch. Then another. It was brutally heavy. My muscles screamed in protest. I was a man of delicate tools and patient movements, not brute force. "Again," Elias commanded, his voice strained. We pushed again, our shoulders pressed against the wood, our feet sliding on the wet floor. I could feel every muscle in my back and legs trembling with the effort. Beside me, I could hear Elias's strained breathing, the sheer force of his will pitted against the dead weight of the case. He was unbelievably strong. Slowly, agonizingly, we managed to shove the case a few feet away from the spreading water to a drier patch of floor. We both collapsed against it, panting, our chests heaving. The red emergency lights made the scene look like something out of a horror film. Water was still pouring from the ceiling, a relentless cascade in the eerie silence. "Okay," Elias said, breathing heavily. "Stay here. Try to move anything else you can off the floor. I'm going for the shut-off valve." He gave me one last, quick look, his eyes boring into mine in the dim light. "You did good, Julian." Then he was gone, his footsteps splashing as he ran down the hall. Left alone in the red-tinged darkness, with the sound of the rushing water filling my ears, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. My panic was gone, replaced by a thrumming adrenaline. He had trusted me. He had relied on me. We had worked together, our bodies straining in unison against a common obstacle. It was the most connected I had ever felt to another human being. I went to work, my movements now efficient and purposeful. I lifted smaller pedestals, moved benches, stacked archival boxes onto dry surfaces. A few minutes later, the torrent of water from the ceiling slowed to a trickle and then stopped. A profound silence descended, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. Elias returned, his hair plastered to his forehead, his gray Henley soaked through. He was breathing hard. "Valves closed," he announced. I've called the emergency maintenance crew. They're on their way, but it'll be a while with this storm. We stood there for a moment, in the middle of the flooded gallery, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the evidence of our small victory. The red light was disorienting, making us both look like strangers. We should check the other pieces, I said, finding my professional voice again. Make sure the humidity hasn't affected anything else. Good idea, he said. For the next hour, we moved through the darkened galleries together, our flashlight beams dancing across paintings and sculptures. We were a team. He would hold the light steady while I inspected a canvas for any signs of moisture, my gloved fingers gently probing the frame. We spoke in low, hushed tones, our conversation purely practical, but the intimacy of the situation was undeniable. We were two people alone in a crisis, moving through a sleeping world, our shared purpose a tangible thing between us. We ended up in the Impressionist gallery, the one where I had seen him sitting on the monitors. The emergency lights were softer here, a pale orange that gave Monet's water lilies a dreamlike quality. We had confirmed everything else was secure. The immediate danger had passed. We both sank onto the central bench, a mutual, unspoken agreement to rest. The exhaustion hit me all at once, my body aching from the unaccustomed exertion. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. You know, Elias said, his voice quiet beside me in the dark. I used to hate storms. I opened my eyes and turned to look at him. His profile was outlined against the soft glow of a distant water lily pond. Why? My parents died in a car crash during a thunderstorm, he said, his voice flat, matter of fact. For years, every time it rained, I'd just lock up. Clara, my sister, she was the one who got me through it. She was just a kid, but she was fearless. She'd make hot chocolate and tell me the thunder was just God bowling. He offered a small, sad smile. Stupid, I know. It's not stupid, I said softly. It was a piece of him, a shard of his past, offered up in the quiet dark. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a glimpse behind the curtain of his stoic competence. He wasn't just the strong, capable guard who had taken charge of the emergency. He was a man who had known deep loss, a man who harbored his own fears. I took this job because it was quiet, he continued, his gaze fixed on the Monet. I thought I needed the silence. To think, too. I don't know. Heal, maybe. But sometimes, the silence in this place is louder than any storm. He turned his head and looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom. It's been less quiet since we started talking. My heart stopped. There it was. An admission. A confession of a kind. He felt it too. The change in the atmosphere, the filling of the empty space between us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think of a single thing to say that wouldn't sound inadequate or foolish. So I just sat there, in the quiet, orange-lit gallery, beside this man who had just shared a piece of his brokenness with me. And in that shared silence, I felt the last of my own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. The distance I had clung to for so long no longer felt safe. It felt like a cage. And for the first time in my life, I wanted out. The aftermath of the flood created a new kind of normal. The damaged gallery was closed for repairs, and a palpable tension hung in the air among the museum staff. But between me and Elias, the tension was of a different sort. The night of the storm had changed everything. We had seen each other's competence and each other's vulnerability. The polite, professional distance was gone forever, replaced by a charged awareness that hummed between us whenever we were in the same room. Our late-night conversations by the door of my studio grew longer. The pretense of patrol checks and borrowed books was dropped. He came to see me. I waited for him. It was that simple. We talked about everything and nothing. We talked about his sister's frustration with the color cadmium red and my own lifelong battle with the color cobalt blue. We talked about his dreams of one day opening a small woodworking shop and my secret desire to live somewhere I could see the ocean from my window. We were mapping the territories of each other's lives, one quiet story at a time. And with every shared confidence, the unresolved tension between us grew, coiling tighter and tighter. It was in the way he held my gaze a second too long. It was in the way I found myself unconsciously leaning into his space, drawn by a gravity I could no longer deny. Physical contact remained a carefully avoided subject. We were like two planets held in a delicate orbit, close enough to feel the pull, but terrified of the collision. The tipping point came on a night so ordinary, it was almost absurd. There was no storm, no crisis. Just another quiet Wednesday. I was feeling particularly drained, having spent 12 hours painstakingly readhering microscopic flecks of paint to a damaged portrait. I was tired, my eyes burned, and my loneliness felt like a physical weight. Elias appeared at my door around 11. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, his expression unusually serious. He had a small paper bag in his hand. "You look like hell," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It was the most brutally honest and tender thing anyone had said to me all week. "I feel like it," I admitted, rubbing my tired eyes. He stepped into the studio and placed the bag on my work table. "I brought you something." He pulled out a thermos and a small, lopsided cupcake with too much frosting. My sister's latest attempt at baking. She calls it a sympathy cupcake. I call it a cry for help. I couldn't help but laugh, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "Thank you." He unscrewed the thermos and poured a steaming, fragrant liquid into the cap. It wasn't coffee. It smelled of chamomile and honey. "Thought you could use this more than caffeine tonight," he said, handing it to me. I took it, our fingers brushing again. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact was brief, but it lingered, a warm spot on my skin. I took a sip of the tea. It was warm and sweet, and it felt like it was healing me from the inside out. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the hum of the ventilation system and my own quiet sipping. Then he asked the question, the one that blew everything wide open. He was looking at the stormy seascape I'd painted, which I'd taken to leaving uncovered. His gaze was intense, analytical. "Do you ever just want to let the storm win, Julian?" I froze, the cup halfway to my lips. He wasn't talking about the painting. I knew he wasn't. He was talking about me. About the carefully controlled, buttoned-up life I had built for myself. About the turbulence I kept hidden just beneath the surface. My heart hammered against my ribs. This is it. The moment of truth. I could deflect. I could pretend I didn't understand. I could make a joke and steer the conversation back to safe, shallow waters. The old me, the man who lived behind the velvet ropes, screamed at me to do just that. But I was so tired of being that man. I lowered the cup and met his gaze. His eyes were dark, patient, waiting. He already knew the answer. He just wanted to hear me say it. "Every single day," I whispered. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and terrifying and true. He held my gaze for a long, breathless moment. The air in the studio grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. I could see the pulse beating in his throat. He took a half-step closer, and my world narrowed to the space between us. He smelled of soap and night air and the faint, sweet scent of the cupcake. "What are you afraid of?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. "Of drowning," I answered, my voice trembling. He took another step. He was so close now I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He reached out, not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that gave me a universe of time to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. His hand came to rest on my arm, his fingers warm and firm through the thin cotton of my shirt. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my core. "You wouldn't be drowning alone," he said. His voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't name, but it wrapped around me like a blanket. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then back to my eyes. It was a question, a silent, profound question that asked for a permission I was suddenly desperate to give. "I am here, in the present, not observing, not analyzing. My heart is a frantic drum against my ribs." His thumb strokes my arm, a small, repetitive motion that undoes me completely. The scent of chamomile, the heat of his skin, the low hum of the lights, it's all hyper-real, a sensory overload that shorts out all my carefully constructed defenses. I can't think. I can only feel. This is the collision I was so afraid of. And all I want is to crash. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. He closed the remaining distance between us. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, and it was the most wonderful thing I had ever felt. He leaned in slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and then he kissed me. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of relief. It was the feeling of a long-held breath being released. His lips were soft, firm, and they tasted faintly of coffee and something that was just him. It wasn't hungry or demanding. It was a statement. It was the end of a long, quiet conversation and the beginning of a new one. I melted into him, my hand coming up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm. It was a rhythm that anchored me, that told me this was real. All the anxiety, the overthinking, the years of quiet yearning, it all dissolved in that one perfect moment. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was a participant. I was here. I was being kissed in the middle of my studio by the night guard who had seen the storm inside of me and hadn't been afraid. When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. We were both breathing heavily. The silence that filled the room now was not empty, not charged with tension, but filled with a profound sense of rightness, of peace. "See," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. Not drowning. The night after the kiss was the longest night of my life. Elias had left shortly after, a quiet squeeze of my hand the only goodbye. There were no promises made, no plans discussed, just the lingering taste of him on my lips and the ghost of his touch on my skin. I went home and didn't sleep. I just lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the kiss on an endless loop. It had been perfect. It had been more than I had ever allowed myself to hope for. And now, in the cold, gray light of dawn, terror began to creep in. What if it was a mistake? A moment of weakness brought on by exhaustion and chamomile tea? What if he regretted it? What if he woke up this morning and decided he had made a colossal error in judgment by kissing the museum's resident hermit? By the time I had to go to work that evening, I had convinced myself that he would avoid me. He would change his patrol route. Our brief, beautiful connection would be severed, and I would be left alone again in the silence. Only this time the silence would be unbearable because I now knew what it could be filled with. I walked into the museum with a sense of impending doom, my stomach a leaden weight. I tried to work, but it was useless. My hands were shaking too much to hold a brush steady. Every footstep in the hall outside my studio made me jump. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitor, waiting for a glimpse of him, dreading it and desperately needing it at the same time. He didn't appear at the usual time. 9 o'clock came and went. 10 o'clock. My anxiety grew with every passing minute. I was right. He was avoiding me. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing ache in my chest. I had let myself hope, and this was the price. I felt foolish, naive. Of course a man like Elias wouldn't be interested in someone like me. He was solid and real and connected to the world. I was a creature of dust and shadows. At 11:30, I gave up. I couldn't stand being in the studio, in the room where it had happened, any longer. I packed my things, my movements jerky and clumsy. I would go home. I would crawl into bed and try to forget the whole thing. I would rebuild my walls, thicker and higher this time. I walked out of the studio and headed for the staff exit, my head down, not wanting to see anyone. As I rounded the corner into the main rotunda, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a massive marble pillar. It was Elias. My heart stopped. He was just standing there, waiting for me. He wasn't in his uniform. He was wearing jeans and a soft, dark sweater. His shift must have ended. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," I managed to squeak out. My throat felt tight. We just stood there for a moment, an awkward, cavernous space between us. The silence was deafening. My mind was screaming. Say something. Say it was a mistake. Get it over with, so I can go home and fall apart. He took a step toward me, then another. He stopped right in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to look at him. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine. "I've been thinking about last night," he said, his voice low. "Me too," I whispered, bracing myself for the blow. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his grip firm and warm and impossibly steady. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental touch. It was a deliberate, declarative act. "I woke up this morning," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "And the first thing I thought was that I wanted to do it again. The second thing I thought was that I wanted to do it somewhere that didn't smell like turpentine." A breath I didn't even know I was holding escaped my lungs in a shaky sigh. Relief washed over me, so potent and overwhelming it made my knees weak. He wasn't regretting it. He wanted more. A slow smile spread across his face, seeing the change in my expression. I'm not good with words, Julian. I never have been. I'm better with doing things. Fixing things. Being there, he squeezed my hand. Last night wasn't a mistake. It was the least mistaken thing I've done in a very long time. All my fear, all my carefully constructed anxieties, just evaporated. They were no match for the simple, solid truth of his presence, of his hand holding mine. He was real. This was real. My shift is over, he said. Let me walk you home. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent. And I, for the first time in as long as I could remember, didn't overthink it. I didn't analyze it. I just accepted it. Okay, I said, my voice filled with a wonder I didn't try to hide. We walked out of the silent museum and into the cold, crisp night air of the sleeping city. The world outside the museum walls had always felt alien to me, a place I didn't quite belong. But walking beside Elias, his hand holding mine, his shoulder occasionally brushing against mine, it felt different. It felt like a place I could learn to navigate. The next few weeks were a quiet revelation. We fell into a new rhythm, one that extended beyond the museum walls. Elias would wait for me to finish my shift, and we would walk home together through the deserted city streets. Sometimes we would talk, our voices low in the stillness. Other times, we would walk in a comfortable silence, his hand in mine the only communication we needed. He started showing up at my apartment on his days off, usually with a bag of groceries and a determined look on his face. You can't live on protein bars and coffee, he'd declare, before taking over my tiny kitchen and proceeding to cook something simple and delicious. I would sit and watch him, mesmerized by the efficient way he moved, the easy confidence he had in the physical world. He was teaching me, without words, that life wasn't something to be observed from a distance, but something to be engaged with, to be tasted and touched and felt. One Saturday, he took me to his sister Clara's studio. It was a chaotic, paint-spattered loft that smelled wonderfully of oil paint and creative energy. Clara was a whirlwind, a younger, more vibrant version of Elias, with the same dark eyes but a smile that was always on the verge of breaking free. She threw her arms around me in a hug that stole my breath. "So you're the famous Julian," she exclaimed. "The book whisperer. My brother hasn't shut up about you for a month." Elias flushed, a dark red creeping up his neck, and mumbled something about checking on the canvases. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. He talked about me. The visit was easy, comfortable. We talked about art, about technique, about the frustrations and joys of creation. I felt seen, understood, in a way I never had before. As we were leaving, Elias paused at the door. He was looking at a small, framed photo on a cluttered table. It was a picture of him and Clara as teenagers, standing in front of a dilapidated farmhouse, their arms around each other, squinting into the sun. They both looked so young, so burdened. "That was right after," he said softly, not needing to explain what he meant. "We had nothing, just that broken-down house and each other." He turned to me, his expression raw and open. "She's all I've got. She's lucky to have you," I said, my voice thick. "I think," he said, his gaze searching mine, "I'm the lucky one. I have her." And now, he trailed off, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. He reached out and took my hand. "And now I have you." The words hung in the space between us, unspoken but perfectly clear. Our first real test came in the form of gossip. The museum, like any workplace, was a hotbed of whispers and speculation. Our new routine hadn't gone unnoticed. The other guards, the daytime curators, the cleaning staff, they had all seen Elias waiting for me, had seen us leave together. One evening, as I was getting coffee, I overheard two of the other night guards talking. "I don't get it," one of them, a gruff older man named Sal, said. "What's a guy like Elias doing with him?" He jerked his head in the direction of my studio. "The painter boy is weird. Barely says a word." "Leave it alone, Sal," the other guard said, though without much conviction. Sal scoffed. "It's just not right. Two guys, it's unnatural." The words were like a punch to the gut. The old, familiar shame and fear washed over me. This was why I kept to myself. This was why I lived behind walls. The world was full of people like Sal, people who would judge and hate what they didn't understand. I backed away before they could see me, my coffee forgotten, and retreated to the safety of my studio, my heart pounding with a cold dread. When Elias came by later that night, I was quiet, withdrawn. He knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want to bring the ugliness of the world into the quiet, safe space we had created. But he was persistent, his patient gaze wearing down my defenses. I finally told him what I had heard, the words coming out in a choked whisper. He listened without interrupting, his expression hardening, his jaw tightening until a muscle jumped. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment. I braced myself for him to pull away, to agree that this was too complicated, too much trouble. Instead, he reached out and tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. His gaze was fierce, a protective fire burning in their depths. "Do you care what a man like Sal thinks?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I hesitated. "I don't want to. But it's hard not to." "Then look at me," he commanded. "Just me. Do I look like I care what Sal thinks? Do I look like I'm ashamed to be seen with you?" I looked at him, at his strong, steady face, at the unwavering conviction in his eyes, and I saw no shame, no doubt, only a fierce, protective loyalty that took my breath away. "No," I whispered. "Good," he said, his voice softening. "Because I'm not. I've spent too much of my life hiding, Julian. Hiding from grief, from responsibility. I'm done with it. I found something good, something real, and I'm not going to let some ignorant old man's pathetic words touch it." He leaned in and kissed me, a hard, defiant kiss that was full of promise and protection. It wasn't a kiss of gentle discovery like the first one. It was a kiss that staked a claim. A kiss that said, "You are mine, and I will not let them hurt you." In that moment, the fear that had been my constant companion for so long finally broke its hold. It couldn't survive in the face of his strength, his certainty. He was my shield. He was my safe harbor. A month later, Elias came to my studio late one night with an unreadable expression on his face. He was holding a plain white envelope. My stomach dropped. It felt like bad news. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice tense. He handed me the envelope. "Clara sold her first big commission," he said, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. "A hotel chain in Chicago. It's enough for her to live on for a year. Maybe more. She's going to be okay." Relief flooded me. "Elias, that's amazing. I'm so happy for her." "For you." "Yeah," he said, his eyes shining. "It is." He looked down at the envelope in my hand, which I now realized I hadn't opened. "It also means I don't need to do this anymore." The bottom fell out of my world. "Do what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This job," he said quietly. "I only ever took it for her. For the hours. The woodworking shop I told you about. I have a friend upstate. He's wanted me to go in with him for years. I can finally do it." I stared at him, my mind reeling. Upstate. That was hours away. He was leaving. He was leaving the museum. He was leaving me. All the security I had felt, all the hope for our new beginning. It was all built on the foundation of this place, of these stolen nights. Without the museum, what were we? When I managed to ask, my voice hollow. "I gave my notice today," he said. "I have 2 more weeks." 2 weeks. It felt like a death sentence. All the old insecurities came rushing back. This had just been a thing of convenience, of proximity. A relationship born of loneliness and shared silence in the middle of the night. Once he was out in the real world, in the daylight, he wouldn't need me anymore. I must have looked as devastated as I felt, because his expression softened, and he stepped forward, taking my hands in his. "Julian," he said, his voice firm, insistent. "Look at me. This isn't the end. It's the beginning." "How?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You'll be hours away. You'll be building a new life. I want to build it with you," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I'm not asking you to give up your work, your life here. Not yet. But I'm asking you not to give up on us. I'm asking you to trust me. To trust this." He squeezed my hands. "This isn't about the museum. It was never about the museum. It's about you." I looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, any flicker of uncertainty. I found none. There was only the same steady, solid conviction that had become my anchor. He believed in us. The question was, did I? Did I have the courage to step out of the shadows of my safe, predictable life and follow him into the light? His last night at the museum felt like a funeral. I watched him on his final patrol, his familiar route a painful reminder of all the nights I had spent watching him from afar. The other guards gave him handshakes and awkward pats on the back. Sal even managed a grudging, "Good luck to ya." When the time came for him to stop by my studio, my heart was a painful knot in my chest. He came in and closed the door behind him. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to me and pulled me into his arms, holding me tight. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent one last time, trying to memorize it. "Don't say goodbye," I whispered against the rough fabric of his uniform. "I'm not," he said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. He pulled back slightly, his hands framing my face. "This is just a change of scenery." He handed me a small, hand-carved wooden box. It was smooth and warm, made of a dark, rich cherry wood. "Open it later." He kissed me then, a long, slow, deep kiss that was full of unspoken promises. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and sorrow and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. When he pulled away, he just looked at me for a long moment, his eyes memorizing my face. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. And then he was gone. The click of the door closing behind him was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The silence he left behind was absolute. It was a crushing, heavy thing, no longer filled with the potential of his arrival. I sat in my studio for hours, unable to work, just staring at the empty doorway. Finally, my hands trembling, I picked up the small wooden box he had given me. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single, old-fashioned brass key. There was no note. It didn't need one. It wasn't a key to a house. It was a key to a future, an invitation, a choice. The next 2 weeks were agonizing. We talked on the phone every day. He told me about the drive upstate, about the small apartment he was renting above the workshop, about the smell of sawdust and the ache in his muscles. I told him about the silence in the museum, about the new guard who was young and loud and never looked at the art. We were trying to bridge the distance with words, but it felt like a poor substitute for his presence. The doubt began to creep back in. Maybe this was too hard. Maybe we were too different. One night, after a particularly stilted and unsatisfying phone call, I found myself staring at the little brass key. I had spent my entire life restoring the past, living among ghosts. I was an expert at preserving things that were already finished. But this key, this was about the future. It was about creating something new. And it terrified me. I thought about my life before Elias. The quiet, lonely routine. The safety of my emotional isolation. It was a half-life, a life lived in monochrome. Elias had brought color into my world. He had shown me what it was like to feel, to trust, to be seen. Could I really go back to the way things were? I made a decision. The next morning, I called my supervisor and requested a leave of absence. I packed a small bag, and then I got in my car and I drove. I drove for hours, the city shrinking in my rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and autumn trees. I drove with the little brass key on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, shining promise. I didn't know what I would say when I got there. I didn't have a plan. For the first time in my life, I was operating on pure, unanalyzed feeling. I found the workshop easily, a large, rustic barn on the edge of a small town. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. I could hear the buzz of a saw from inside. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady. I pushed open the large, heavy door. The vast space was filled with golden afternoon light, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. And there he was. He was standing at a workbench, his back to me, his shoulders broad in a worn flannel shirt. He was planing a long piece of wood, his movements strong, sure, and graceful. He must have sensed me, because he stopped, his hands still on the plane. He turned around slowly. His eyes widened when he saw me. He was covered in a fine layer of sawdust. His hair was a mess, and he had never looked more beautiful. He didn't speak. He just dropped the tool onto the workbench with a clatter and started walking toward me. He moved with that same steady, unhurried gait I had watched on the security monitors 1,000 times. But this time, he wasn't walking away. He was walking toward me. He stopped right in front of me, his eyes searching my face, a look of stunned, hopeful disbelief in their depths. I held up the key. "I think this belongs to you," I said, my voice shaking. "But I'm going to need you to show me which door it opens." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the smile of a man who had come home. He took the key from my hand, his fingers closing around mine. It opens all of them, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And then he pulled me into his arms and kissed me, right there in the middle of his sun-drenched, sawdust-filled new beginning. And as I kissed him back, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was my new beginning, too. The silence was finally, truly gone. And in its place was the beautiful, noisy, wonderful sound of our life, just getting started. I was no longer afraid of the storm. I was standing in the heart of it, and I had never felt so safe.